So let's dive in a little bit more to what an extensive property is. So here are some examples of four um, measurements we might do or descriptions we might do when we're classifying matter. And we can classify these particular properties as extensive properties or intensive properties. So these are some four common extensive properties that chemists look at when they're classifying matter. The first one is mass. We talked about that already. So the amount or the weight of an item is going to depend on how much of that we are dealing with. So how much we place on the scale. So because it is dependent on the amount, mass is an extensive property. Volume. So we can look at volume in two ways. One, we can look at the volume of a regular object. And when we're dealing with the volume of a regular object, so these are regular shapes that you learned in geometry, you had all of those volume equations and you could find the volume of regular objects. So we deal with a lot of cubes and a lot of regular shapes like cylinders and cones, and all of those had a mathematical equation to calculate volume. So here, volume of a regular cube, we know is just the length times the width times the height. And then we can determine the volume from those simple calculations. But again, it's going to depend on the amount of the block of wood or the amount of the block of lead that we're dealing with when we're taking those measurements. So it's dependent on the amount of the substance. We can find the volume of irregular objects like a liquid that take the shape of their measuring device or container, and we use a graduated cylinder. So excuse my awful drawing. Here's my graduated cylinder here, and I can fill it up with the water, and we can measure the volume. There's my eyeball, based off the meniscus. All right, but again, that depends on how much gets poured into the graduated cylinder. So it's dependent on the amount. Flexibility of a metal sheet. So a lot of chemists, when dealing with metals, we look at some of the properties of a metal, which are being able to hammer it into sheets, being able to look at the flexibility and the tensile strength. And flexibility of metal sheets is dependent on how thick the sheet is. So if it's really a thin sheet, you can bend it pretty easily. Think of tinfoil. If you start getting into sheets of aluminum or copper, some of those are going to bend more easily depending on the thickness of that sheet. So that's dependent on the amount, because the thicker the sheet, the more metal is used and the less flexibility you're going to have. So that is an extensive property. Another extensive property is surface area. And surface area is the area on the outside. So think perimeter. I always think perimeter. I know that's not technically mathematically correct, but that's how I think of surface area. It's the perimeter. And again, the surface area depends on the amount of substance. If I have a huge chunk of, let's say, a salt, right? A huge chunk is going to have a big surface area because we have more perimeter exposed. If I have a small piece of salt, all right, that perimeter is much smaller, so I have less surface area, less contact with other things. So again, it's dependent on the amount.